Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Anton Warrenchuk in Baltimore. The controversy around the Obama administration's decision to conduct a prisoner swap with the Taliban for Army Sergeant Bowe Bergdahl continues to rage in Washington. On Wednesday, Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel defended the deal in front of Congress, saying, quote, "War, every part of war, like prisoner exchanges, is not some abstract or theoretical exercise. The hard choices and options don't fit neatly into clearly defined instructions in how-to manuals. All of these decisions are part of the brutal, imperfect realities we all deal with in war." Meanwhile, the Pentagon says Bergdahl's current condition, he is still unfit to be returned to the United States. Joining us now to discuss this are our two guests. Camilo Mejia is a member of the Iraq Veterans Against the War. Camilo was the first U.S. soldier fighting in Iraq to file an application for conscientious objector status in 2004 in protest of U.S. military treatment of prisoners he describes as war crimes. He is also the author of The Road from R. Ramadi, the Private Rebellion of Sergeant Camilo Mejia. Also joining us is James M. Branum, who is a civilian attorney who defends conscientious objectors and war resistors. He is the legal director of the Center for Conscience in Action. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
So James, what possible consequences do deserters face, and how has this changed in terms of, let's say, the severity of punishment since soldiers began to desert from the Afghanistan and Iraq wars?
One important thing to note when discussing the idea of desertion is that desertion is a compound crime. It combines the crime of absence without leave with an intent element, either the intent to remain away forever or the intent to shirk hazardous duty. Most people, service members who leave their post, who are AWOL, are not deserters. But for those who are, potential punishment ranges as high as 5 years in prison. Theoretically, the death penalty, even though that has not been utilized since World War II. In practice, though, most service members who leave without permission receive much less. In the modern era, no one has received more than 24 months in prison. Most receive 6 months or less, and many receive no jail time at all, but are instead separated out administratively. Who gets punished the worst often depends on the circumstances, but more often depends upon the individual command and their attitude. Some commanders have a heart, have compassion for service members in difficult situations. Other commanders do not. And so often two service members who have committed theoretically the same crime, similar circumstances, may be treated very differently.
And do you think that soldiers are limited in their ability to exercise their First Amendment rights, especially when it comes to issues on war policy or speaking out against the war?
They are. While the First Amendment theoretically is extended to service members, in practice, the courts have allowed a certain level of restrictions on service members' First Amendment rights, including the rules that service members are not allowed to protest the war or protest anything while in uniform, while on post, while in a foreign country, or in any incident where violence might occur. Outside of those boundaries, service members can speak very freely about their political beliefs, about what they believe about war. The challenge is that for many service members, talking isn't enough. They want their actions to match their words. And the challenge is when service members begin to feel disillusionment with the mission or disillusionment with their role in the military itself, even maybe to the point of having issues of conscience, to do the steps that most of us in civilian lives can do if we're not happy with our jobs, if we are morally conflicted about our jobs. In the civilian world, we can quit. In the military, it's not that simple. Service members are effectively, they've signed a contract that's not really a contract because it doesn't function like a civilian contract. It's probably more accurate to describe it as a slave agreement that requires that service members are bound in this agreement in ways that they would be criminally prosecuted if they break the agreement. And so it's a very difficult situation for many service members who are feeling that conflict of conscience. There are options such as conscience objection that they can follow, and a lot of groups around to help them, including the GI Rights Hotline, the Military Law Task Force, the National Lawyers Guild, a lot of good groups out there. The challenge is for most service members, they're not aware of those resources. And so when faced with moments of crisis, they end up going it alone and often having to take self-help approaches, which may or may not work out well for them. It's a really frustrating situation. One thing I'd also add is that service members who don't know about their rights can't effectively exercise them. And this is one of the challenges that many service members have never heard the words conscientious objection. They don't know the concept even exists. All that they understand is that their consciences are conflicted and they don't know what to do. And it's a really tough place to be in.
Do you think that any reforms or changes are needed in the legal system or within military policy in order to protect or further the First Amendment rights of U.S. soldiers?
One of the big issues is that service members should be informed of their right to file for conscientious objection. That should be a stated thing, that the command is required to train and provide information on this right. That is the first and most important thing. Beyond that, there needs to be reforms in the military justice system itself. One of the major problems is the role of convening authority, which basically allows the commander to not only decide if a service member is prosecuted for a crime, but also to decide who will be on the jury that will try the service member and will decide what kind of plea deals are acceptable and not acceptable. That's too many people having control of the very same process, and that's not acceptable. We need to make it a system that's more detached. In Canada, their military justice system has an independent judiciary, an independent prosecutor, and that is not part of the military establishment. And because of that, they have a better system than we do.
So Camilo, talk about your experience as a conscientious objector. Why did you decide to go AWOL and not decide to pursue other official channels for protesting or criticizing the Iraq War?
Well, I didn't really know I could be a conscientious objector, as James Branum just said. It's not something that it's really available to people in the military, in that we don't really know about it. Another misconception is that if you signed up to be in the military, then there's no way that you can be a conscientious objector because you've signed the contract, or the slave contract, as James put it. The idea is that conscientious objection is a recourse that's available for people when there's a draft in place. So a lot of members of the military don't know that there is this way out through conscience. So I didn't really know I was able to apply for a conscientious objection when I first came home from the war, and it really took a while for me to even accept the possibility that I could be a conscientious objector when I spoke with one of the organizations that works with the GI rights hotline. One of the counselors told me, it sounds like you're a conscientious objector. You should really consider applying for conscientious objector status. And at the time, I said to myself, I'm an infantry squad leader. I served in Iraq already. I was in several firefights. We were ambushed, you name it, and we went through it. So to me, it was too late for me to be a conscientious objector. It was after a lot of thinking, and once I already had decided not to go back to the war, that I started working on my application for CO status. And that's when I realized that the experience of war is actually the most convincing argument for conscientious objection. It's the one thing that has the most power to turn somebody from a gung-ho soldier into a war resistor or a conscientious objector. So it was a process for me, and the first thing was to even allow myself the possibility to be a conscientious objector in my heart, and then following that dictate from my conscience. But it wasn't easy. It was difficult. Like James said, there are a lot of obstacles for people to apply, and it was no different for me.
And how does the media portrayal as well as the political controversy surrounding Bowe Bergdahl compare with your experience as a war resistor?
Well, there's very little that we know about him. We know from the emails that he sent to his dad that he was very disenchanted with the war, but that's really the same for a lot of servicemen and women in the military. The only difference is that they didn't walk off from their base. But there's a lot of disaffection within the military with not just the war in Afghanistan, but the entire global war on terror. There's no real sense of mission. And I think that the morale is pretty much, at an all-time low. And there's really not really much that we know beyond those emails. In my case, I was very public with my decision not to go back to the war. I talked about the immorality of the war. I talked about the fact that in the context of international law, the war was illegal because it was not the result of self-defense, and there was no approval from the UN Security Council. I also talked about my views that I felt like this was an oil-driven war for profit, and that we were committing a lot of crimes. So of course there was a lot more to be said in terms of why I refused to go back to Iraq. There's not really much we know about Bowe Bergdahl, but I think that the reaction from conservative pro-war people, particularly politicians, doesn't really have that much to do with Bergdahl himself or his rationale for walking off from his base, but it has more to do with protecting the military-industrial complex and our ability to stay in Afghanistan. The swap for the 5 Taliban soldiers in exchange for the last prisoner of war sounds like the war is going to end. And obviously, you have a lot of people in the power establishment who don't want that. So regardless of the reasons why he walked off, what we're hearing is a backlash to removing our troops from Afghanistan. And then also the fact that the president, without congressional permission, decided to free 5 Taliban fighters from Guantanamo also sets a legal precedent that could open the door for the closing of Guantanamo Bay Prison. So what we're hearing right now is a backlash not to Bergdahl's action necessarily, but to the consequences of that action and the consequences of the president deciding to do this swap.
And Camilo, with your experience as a U.S. military service member, how much space is there within the military culture for soldiers to criticize or dissent against either foreign policy or day-to-day on-the-ground military strategy and tactics?
In theory, there isn't really a whole lot of space. You're trained not to think for yourself. You're trained to act as part of a unit. You're trained to remove feelings and emotions and thoughts and to basically act as a machine. The way that they train you, not just the marching or the uniform or the haircut and all those other things, are meant to really destroy your sense of being an individual. So there isn't really a whole lot of encouragement when you become a member of the U.S. military to think for yourself or be critical or question anything. However, we're looking at the longest war that the United States has been engaged in. And you have people who have deployed up to 10 times to Iraq or Afghanistan or both. And so you have a very different military from the military that first invaded Afghanistan. You have a military that's tired. You have a military that has no sense of mission, that's demoralized. So you're going to see and hear a lot of disaffection with the war and the mission. And just very recently, I was watching Democracy Now! And they were showing excerpts from a documentary that had some footage from Bergdahl's unit, and you can hear soldiers there talking about how basically we have no business being in Afghanistan and that we're not really accomplishing anything there. So we don't really hear any of this in the corporate media because the dialogue they don't want the dialogue to be centered around the breakdown of military morale or the loss of sense of mission. They want this to be about saving the war and saving whatever ability they have to keep people, indefinitely incarcerated without being charged. But I think that, just to answer your question, there's a huge difference between where troops are now and where troops were when we first invaded Iraq and Afghanistan.
Okay, Camilo Mejia, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
James Branum, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.